I always knew my role in the family. I was the eldest, the one everyone could count on, the one who'd step in whenever things went wrong. While other kids my age were playing sports or going to dances, I was babysitting my younger brother Leo or working shifts at the grocery store to help cover bills. My parents needed me, and I thought that meant they valued me. But that belief, as I was about to learn, was only a comforting lie I'd told myself. The first blow came during dinner on a sticky summer evening. My father had called us all together, saying he had big news. I thought maybe they'd saved enough to help with my college fund finally. I'd been accepted to a university out of state, a full scholarship for tuition, but the room, board, and books would still cost more than we could easily afford. I'd been quietly saving, chipping away at the costs bit by bit. But when my father looked at me that night, the last thing I saw was joy. "We've decided to use your savings for Leo's wedding," my dad said, his tone infuriatingly matter of fact, as if he was announcing the weather. "It's only fair, considering all he's done for us." I couldn't believe it. I could feel my jaw hanging open, my mind spinning. Leo wasn't even engaged last I'd heard, but I could see the glimmer of pride in his eyes as if this was all part of his grand plan. Leo's wedding? I managed to stammer, my voice sounding hollow to my own ears. "Dad, that money was for my college expenses. I've been working so hard. How could you decide this without even telling me?" My mother, sitting across from me with her lips pursed, leaned forward. "Eva, this is what family does. Leo is the youngest. He deserves a good start in life, and his fiancée comes from a nice family. We need to make a good impression." My stomach twisted. I'd been scrimping and saving for years, making so many sacrifices, putting my dreams on hold so that we could scrape by. And now they were going to throw that money away on a party? On some grand gesture for Leo, who never had to lift a finger or take responsibility for anything. "What about my start in life?" I asked, barely managing to keep my voice steady. "Doesn't my education matter to you? All those nights I spent working, were they for nothing?" Leo, who had been sitting there, quietly smug, suddenly leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Eva, come on. It's not like you're giving up your whole life. You're still going to college, right? It's just a small sacrifice for the family." His words stung more than I could have imagined. Small sacrifice? Years of saving and juggling school with work, never asking for help, doing everything I could to make things easier for them. And this was just a small sacrifice. What has Leo done for this family? I shot back, my anger finally bubbling to the surface. I'm the one who's been helping pay bills, making sacrifices. What's he done but take? The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. My mother's eyes flashed with irritation, and my father sighed heavily, as though I was the one being unreasonable. "Eva," my mother said sharply, "you're being selfish. Leo is family, and family means supporting each other. It's not always about you. Sometimes you have to put others first." Selfish. They actually thought I was the selfish one. I could feel a hot, prickling sensation in my eyes, but I wouldn't let myself cry. Not in front of them. I wasn't going to let them see how much they'd hurt me. "So, what am I to you all then? A free source of labor? A bank account to dip into whenever Leo needs something?" My voice cracked despite my best efforts to hold it together. My father looked at me with an expression that felt both pitying and dismissive. "Eva, you'll understand one day. We all make sacrifices for family, and in a few years, you won't even remember this." I wanted to scream. How could they dismiss everything I'd done? Everything I'd worked for? This wasn't a small favor. They were stripping me of the future I'd painstakingly built piece by piece. I pushed back from the table, my appetite gone, my heart a tight, angry knot in my chest. "Fine. Do what you want," I muttered. "But don't expect me to be okay with this." As I stormed out of the room, I could hear my mother sighing behind me. "Teenagers," she murmured, as if I was being unreasonable, a child throwing a tantrum. I couldn't stand it. The betrayal burned deep, sharper than anything I'd ever felt. They were supposed to be my family, my safety net, the people who would always support me. But in that moment, I saw the truth. Over the next few days, I buried myself in my work, barely speaking to anyone. I avoided Leo, who strutted around the house like a prince, oblivious to the pain he'd caused. I couldn't even look my parents in the eye. They'd taken something irreplaceable from me, and I didn't know if I could ever forgive them. But the breaking point came at Leo's engagement party. I hadn't wanted to go, but my mother insisted, saying it would look bad if the whole family wasn't there. So I put on a brave face, stood off to the side, and watched as my parents fussed over Leo and his fiancée, beaming as if they'd won the lottery. People kept coming up to me, congratulating me as though I was thrilled to be there. "Aren't you just so proud of your brother?" they'd say, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. And each time, I forced a smile, nodding politely, all while resentment bubbled beneath the surface. Then, in the middle of the evening, I overheard my mother talking to one of her friends. She was gushing about how perfect everything was turning out, how proud she was of Leo, how she and Dad had made some sacrifices to give him the best start in life. A sacrifice. That's all I was to them. A convenience to give up, a stepping stone for someone else. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I didn't want to be their sacrifice anymore. I slipped out of the party early, numb and disoriented, and walked all the way home, the cool night air doing nothing to ease the tightness in my chest. By the time I reached the house, I knew what I had to do. Back in my room, I started packing. Every piece of clothing, every book, every memento I cared about went into my suitcase. I grabbed my laptop and my savings, everything I'd worked so hard to build, and made a plan. I'd been accepted into that university on a scholarship, and I'd find a way to make it work on my own. I didn't need their support. I never really had it anyway. I left a note on the kitchen counter, a few short lines explaining that I was leaving, that I couldn't stay in a place where my dreams were treated like an afterthought, where my sacrifices were invisible. I didn't need them to understand. I just needed them to know. As I walked out the door for the last time, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and relief. I was walking away from everything I'd ever known, but for the first time, I felt like I was walking toward something real, toward a life that was mine, where I could be more than just the family's backup plan. I took one last look at the house, the home that had sheltered me but never truly felt like mine. Then, with a deep breath, I turned and walked away, leaving behind the family who saw me as nothing more than a sacrifice. Starting over wasn't easy. In the beginning, every day felt like a battle. I arrived in the new city with barely enough money to cover my first month's rent, living in a cramped studio that felt like a shoebox, with walls thin enough to hear every neighbor's late-night argument. But it was mine. Every inch of that tiny room represented my independence, my defiance, my determination to prove that I didn't need anyone who treated me like a disposable crutch. I threw myself into work, finding jobs wherever I could, waiting tables, cleaning offices, helping out at a small bookstore on weekends. My classes started soon after, and balancing work with school left me running on coffee and stubbornness. But I loved it. The exhaustion was a badge of honor, a reminder that every sleepless night, every skipped meal was for me. Not for Leo, not for my parents, but for me and the life I was building on my own terms. In those first few months, I kept my distance from my family. The occasional message would pop up from my mom or dad, usually short and oddly detached, as if they didn't quite know what to say now that I wasn't there to depend on. I'd reply politely, but never with much detail. I didn't want them to know how well I was doing, didn't want to give them any reason to think they still had a claim on my life. As time went on, the bitterness faded into something quieter. I buried myself in my studies, pursuing a business degree, and found myself excelling. I was hungry to learn, to succeed, to do something that would make all the sacrifices worth it. And slowly, I built a network of friends, people who had no idea about the family drama that had driven me here. They knew me as Eva, the driven one, the girl who never missed a deadline and was always willing to help. For once, I was surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, not what I could do for them. A few years passed, and my life became something I was proud of. I managed to land an internship at a small startup during my final year of college. By the time I graduated, they offered me a full-time position. The work was challenging but fulfilling, and the company was small enough that I felt I was truly contributing. I poured myself into that job, working long hours, always volunteering for extra projects, and eventually they promoted me. It felt like validation, like proof that all the sacrifices and heartbreak had led me somewhere worth going. I wish I could say I forgot about my family entirely, but every so often, especially on quiet nights when the city felt too vast and the loneliness crept in, memories would drift back. I'd think of Leo, wonder if he'd matured, if he'd ever understood the pain he'd caused. I wondered if my parents missed me, if they regretted their choices, or if I was just a ghost in their past, someone who had once been useful and was now easily forgotten. Then one night, out of the blue, my phone rang. It was my mother. I hesitated, staring at her name flashing on the screen, memories flooding back. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let it fade away like so many unanswered calls from the past. But curiosity got the better of me, and with a deep breath, I answered. Eva. My mother's voice was strained, a mix of relief and something I couldn't quite place. It's been so long. Yeah, it has, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. She hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. We haven't heard from you. Leo's been asking about you, you know. He says he misses you. I bit back a laugh. Leo? He misses me. Yes, she insisted. He's been going through a rough time. His business. Well, it hasn't been easy for him. And you know, your father and we've had some difficulties as well. She danced around the details, but I could fill in the blanks. Leo had always been impulsive, and from what I'd seen on social media, his idea of business involved a lot of flashy investments and very little actual work. It was only a matter of time before reality caught up with him. I'm sorry to hear that, I said, and I meant it, to some extent. But the sympathy was tempered by a cautious distance. I wasn't the same person I'd been when I left. We need your help, Eva, she said finally, her voice softening, almost pleading. Leo's debts, they're serious. And with your father's health issues, we can't handle this on our own. The familiar weight settled over me, a heavy cloak of responsibility I thought I'd cast off for good. They needed me. After all this time, they still expected me to be the one to save them. I could feel the anger bubbling beneath the surface, years of resentment clawing its way up, but I kept my voice steady. What exactly are you asking, Mom? She sighed. We thought maybe you could lend us some money, just enough to cover Leo's debts until he can get back on his feet. You're doing so well for yourself, and we wouldn't ask if we had any other options. I took a deep breath, fighting to keep my voice steady. So let me get this straight. After everything I went through, after all the sacrifices I made, you're asking me to throw away everything I've built to bail Leo out of his mistakes. There was a long pause, and when my mother spoke again, her voice was cold, defensive. Eva, your family. This is what family does. We support each other. I let out a bitter laugh. Is that what family does, Mom? Because I seem to remember a time when I needed support, and you chose to spend my savings on Leo's wedding instead. That was different, she snapped, her tone sharpening. Leo had a future, a family to think about. You were just. Just what? I interrupted, my voice rising. Just the help? Just the one who is supposed to sacrifice everything without expecting anything in return. She fell silent, and in that silence, I felt the last remnants of guilt and duty melting away. I was done. I was done being the one they turned to only when it suited them, done sacrificing my life to cover for their mistakes. I'm sorry, Mom, I said, my voice cold and firm. But I won't do it. I won't be dragged back into that role again. I've worked too hard to get here, and I'm not going to throw it all away because Leo made poor choices. But, Eva, she began, desperation creeping into her tone, but I cut her off. No, I can't help you. Not this time. I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me as I said the words, as if a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had finally been lifted. There was a long silence on the other end, and then she spoke, her voice barely a whisper. Feeny, if that's how you feel, then I suppose we'll have to find another way. Without another word, she hung up, leaving me staring at the phone, my heart pounding. I could still feel the sting of their betrayal, the years of sacrifice and loyalty that had been so casually discarded. But this time, I didn't feel the familiar pang of guilt. I felt free. In the days that followed, there were few more messages, brief and desperate, but I ignored them. I threw myself into my work, focused on the life I'd built, the friends I'd made, the success I'd achieved. And as the days turned into weeks, I began to realize something. I didn't need their approval, their validation. I didn't need to be their savior anymore. I was my own person, and I was finally free. After that last phone call with my mother, I thought the chapter with my family was finally closed. For the first time, I felt fully liberated. I threw myself into my life, building something I could call my own. My career flourished as my company took off, and I found myself rising through the ranks faster than I'd ever imagined. Each milestone felt like vindication, proof that I'd made the right decision by walking away. Months passed, then years. Occasionally, I'd get a brief message from my mother, updates that felt distant and impersonal. Leo was still struggling, his so called business ventures going nowhere. I always wished him well, but never extended an invitation for more. I kept that door firmly closed, focused on the life I'd created for myself without them. Then one evening, as I was heading home after a long day at the office, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. Eva, it's Leo. I need to talk to you. It's important. I stood there on the crowded city sidewalk, staring at the message, feeling a swirl of emotions, irritation, curiosity, maybe even a small pang of pity. I'd spent so long trying to bury the hurt and resentment, to create a life where his problems weren't my responsibility. And now, out of nowhere, he was reaching out, expecting me to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to delete the message and pretend it had never come. But a stronger part of me, the part that had always needed closure, that had always craved some semblance of justice, decided I couldn't walk away just yet. I needed to hear him out, if only to confirm that I'd made the right choice in letting him go. Reluctantly, I texted back, "Fine. I'll meet you for coffee tomorrow." The next morning, I walked into a small cafe near my office, scanning the room until I spotted him. Leo looked different, worn down in a way I'd never seen before. His once cocky demeanor had faded, replaced by something desperate and hollow. He rose to greet me, a weak smile flickering across his face, but I didn't bother returning it. We sat down in silence, the weight of years of estrangement hanging heavy between us. Finally, Leo cleared his throat, his eyes darting around the room before he spoke. "Thanks for meeting me, Eva. I know things haven't been easy between us." I crossed my arms, keeping my expression neutral. "Just get to the point, Leo. What do you want?" He winced at my bluntness but nodded, leaning forward with an intensity that made me wary. "Look, I'm in trouble. Serious trouble. The debts, it's worse than I let mom and dad know. And now there's, well, legal stuff too." He swallowed hard, his eyes pleading. I didn't know who else to turn to. A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. "So, you're here because you want my help. Again." "No," he said quickly, but I could see the guilt written all over his face. "Well, maybe yes. But it's not just money, Eva. I need you to help me fix things. You're smart, you're successful. I thought maybe if you helped me straighten things out, I could finally get back on track." The audacity of it all left me speechless. After everything, after years of being ignored, after they drained my resources for his benefit, now he thought I'd swoop in to save him? The anger simmered, years of repressed resentment coming to the surface. "Why would I do that, Leo? Give me one good reason why I should lift a finger for you." He lowered his head, unable to meet my gaze. Because you're my sister. We're family. I know I've made mistakes. I know I wasn't there for you, but this is different. I'm asking you because I don't have anyone else." The vulnerability in his voice was unexpected, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of the old protectiveness I used to have for him. But then, just as quickly, I remembered all the sacrifices I'd made, the years of betrayal and dismissal. Family, I repeated, my voice cold. Family is supposed to be there for each other. I was always there for you. But where were you, Leo, when I needed help? When mom and dad decided to use my savings for your wedding, did you ever think about me? Did you ever even apologize? He fidgeted, his face paling, but he didn't respond. I could see the shame in his eyes, but it wasn't enough. Not this time. I shook my head, leaning back in my chair. I can't help you, Leo. I won't. I've worked too hard to get where I am, and I'm not about to throw it all away because you made a mess of your life. His face crumpled, his voice barely above a whisper. So, that's it? You're just going to turn your back on us? Us. I scoffed. There is no us, Leo. There never was. There was just me, working my fingers to the bone to support a family that saw me as nothing more than a resource. I deserve better than that. He looked defeated, his shoulders slumping as he realized I wasn't going to change my mind. I stood up, grabbing my bag and turning to leave. But as I reached the door, I stopped, glancing back at him one last time. Leo, I hope you figure things out. I really do, but I'm not your safety net anymore. That part of my life is over. I walked out of the cafe, leaving him behind, feeling a strange sense of closure settle over me. It wasn't relief exactly, but something heavier and more final. I was done with him, with the endless cycle of giving without getting anything in return. In the weeks that followed, I braced myself for more messages from my parents, expecting them to call me selfish, to beg or guilt me into bailing Leo out once again. But for once, the silence was almost deafening. They didn't call, didn't reach out. It was as if my refusal had finally shattered the illusion, as if they realized I was no longer the person they could manipulate and use. For the first time, I felt truly free, unburdened by the obligations and guilt that had once chained me to them. I poured all of my energy into my work, throwing myself into new projects, challenging myself to reach even higher. Every success felt like a victory, a testament to the life I'd built in spite of everything I'd endured. Yet, there were quiet moments, late nights alone in my apartment, weekends when the silence felt too thick, when a pang of loneliness would creep in. I'd think about what it would be like to have a family who truly cared, who celebrated my achievements instead of taking them for granted. I'd wonder if they ever regretted what they'd done, if they ever missed the sister and daughter who had once sacrificed everything for them. But those thoughts would pass, like distant echoes of a life I no longer belonged to. I had made my peace with the past, had learned to live with the scars they'd left behind. Months passed, and the quiet became normal, comfortable even. I'd filled my life with friendships, with colleagues who respected me, with new hobbies and passions that I never had time for before. I'd found my own version of happiness, one that didn't rely on anyone else's approval. One evening, as I sat in my office reviewing some final reports before the weekend, my assistant knocked on my door. Eva, there's a delivery for you downstairs. They said it's urgent. Curious, I made my way down to the lobby, half expecting some last-minute work documents. Instead, a courier handed me a small, carefully wrapped package. There was no note, just a return address, my parents' home address. I felt a rush of mixed emotions, torn between opening it right there and tossing it in the trash. But something compelled me to open it, a strange sense of finality that I couldn't ignore. Inside, I found an old family photo. It was taken years ago, back when things were simpler, when I still believed in the idea of family. I was holding Leo as a baby, my parents beside us, all of us smiling as if nothing could ever break us apart. But along with the photo was a letter, written in my mother's familiar script. I hesitated before unfolding it, bracing myself for the contents. It was short, only a few lines, but each word hit me harder than I'd expected. Eva, I know we haven't always been fair to you. I know we made mistakes, ones I'm not sure we can ever fix. But please know that you were loved, even if we didn't show it in the way you deserved. I hope one day you can forgive us. There was no signature, no plea for reconciliation, just a simple message. I closed my eyes, the weight of everything settling over me. a mix of sadness, regret, and a lingering ache that I hadn't let myself feel in years. But as I tucked the letter and photo back into the envelope, I realized something. Forgiveness wasn't something I owed them. It was something I owed myself. I didn't have to forget what they'd done or invite them back into my life, but I could choose to let go of the bitterness, to move forward without the weight of resentment. With a steadying breath, I walked back to my office, feeling lighter somehow, as if a burden I hadn't even realized I was carrying had finally lifted. I was ready for whatever came next, ready to live fully in the life I'd created for myself, free, strong, and finally, at peace. The days after receiving my mother's letter were filled with a strange, unexpected quiet. I had spent so many years carrying anger and resentment like armor, shielding myself from the wounds they'd left behind. But now, there was an emptiness where the bitterness used to be, an openness I wasn't quite sure how to handle. For the first time, I allowed myself to think about forgiveness, not for them, but for me. Maybe I could release the pain and let it fade, so I could move forward without the burden of my family's past mistakes weighing me down. I didn't need to let them back into my life, didn't need to reopen old wounds to forgive them. I could just let go. The next few months were transformative. With each day that passed, I felt lighter, freer, as though I was finally stepping into the life I had built without looking back. My work thrived, and I took on new projects, expanded my network, even started mentoring others who reminded me of my younger self, ambitious, driven, ready to take on the world but held back by something invisible. One evening, after wrapping up a long day, I decided to celebrate by treating myself to a quiet dinner at a nearby restaurant. As I sat there, savoring my meal and reflecting on everything I'd accomplished, my phone buzzed on the table. I glanced down, expecting a message from a colleague or friend, but instead, it was a name I hadn't seen in a long time, my mother. I stared at the screen, a sense of dread creeping in. We hadn't spoken since she'd sent that letter. I thought I'd made my peace, that I was ready to move on, but seeing her name brought back a flood of memories I thought I'd finally buried. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, letting it fade away like so many of the other calls I'd missed over the years. But something made me answer. "Hello," I said, my voice cautious. "Eva." My mother's voice was soft, almost hesitant. "I'm sorry to call you like this. I know it's been a long time, but I didn't know who else to reach out to." I closed my eyes, bracing myself. "What is it, Mom?" She took a shaky breath, and for the first time, I could hear the strain in her voice, the weight of something serious. "It's your father. He's not well, Eva. He's had a stroke." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. My father, the man I'd spent years resenting, the man who had been the source of so much hurt, was now lying helpless. I felt an odd mix of emotions, anger, sorrow, and a strange, lingering guilt that I couldn't quite place. I, I'm sorry, I said, struggling to find the right words. "We're at the hospital now," she continued, her voice trembling. "They don't know how much longer he has. He keeps asking about you. I know you have every reason not to, but if there's any chance you could come, it would mean the world to him, to both of us." A thousand thoughts swirled through my mind. I'd finally freed myself from the chains of my family, had worked so hard to build a life without them, without the pain of their betrayal. But now, as I stood on the edge of something final, I felt the pull of unfinished business, the weight of unspoken words. "Where are you?" I asked, surprising myself. She gave me the name of the hospital, and after a moment's hesitation, I agreed to come. As I hung up, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping back into something dangerous, something I'd spent years trying to escape. But I had to see him, had to know if there was a way to close this chapter without regret. The hospital was cold and sterile, a place I'd avoided since I was a child. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow on everything, making it all feel surreal. I found my mother in the waiting room, looking older than I'd ever seen her face etched with worry and exhaustion. She looked up as I approached, relief flooding her face. "Eva, thank you for coming." I nodded, unsure of what to say, feeling a strange sense of distance. This woman, my mother, was both familiar and foreign, a reminder of everything I tried to leave behind. "How is he?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. Her face fell, and she looked down at her hands. "Not well. The doctors, they aren't hopeful. He keeps asking for you, though. He wants to see you." Part of me wanted to turn and leave, to walk out and close the door on this chapter once and for all. But something deep inside held me in place, urging me to confront whatever lay ahead. I followed my mother down the sterile hallway, my heart pounding with each step. When we reached his room, she paused, looking at me with something like fear in her eyes. "Eva," she said softly, "I know we haven't been the parents you deserved. I know we made mistakes, terrible ones. But please, if you can, just forgive him. He's been through so much." I said nothing, just pushed the door open and stepped inside. My father lay in the hospital bed, his face pale and drawn, his once strong frame now frail and vulnerable. He looked up as I entered, his eyes flickering with recognition, and for a moment, we just stared at each other, the weight of years of silence hanging between us. "Eva," he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. I swallowed, trying to keep my composure. "Hey, but—" A weak smile crossed his face, and he reached out a trembling hand. I hesitated, then took it, feeling the unfamiliar fragility of his grip, a reminder that time had taken its toll on all of us. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "For everything. I should have. I should have been better." The words hung in the air, a confession I'd waited years to hear but had long ago stopped expecting. Part of me wanted to tell him it was too late, that his apology couldn't erase the pain or the years of sacrifice. But as I looked at him, lying there, vulnerable and broken, I felt the anger start to melt away, replaced by something quieter, something gentler. "It's okay, Dad," I said, the words surprising me. "I forgive you." His eyes filled with tears, and he squeezed my hand, his grip weak but filled with a desperate gratitude. In that moment, I realized that forgiveness didn't mean erasing the past or pretending the pain hadn't existed. It simply meant choosing to let go, to allow myself to heal. He closed his eyes, a look of peace settling over his face, and I sat there, holding his hand, feeling the weight of years slipping away. When he finally drifted off to sleep, I released his hand and quietly left the room, feeling a sense of closure I hadn't expected. Outside, my mother was waiting, her eyes red and swollen. She looked at me, a mixture of hope and fear in her gaze, as though she was unsure of where we stood. "Eva," she began, her voice hesitant. I know. I know we hurt you. I know it may be too late, but if there's any way we can make things right." I took a deep breath, feeling the familiar sting of old wounds, but also the clarity of a new perspective. "Mom, I don't know if we can ever go back to what we were. Too much has happened, and I've built a life apart from all of this. But I can forgive you. I think, for my own sake, I need to forgive you." Her face crumpled, and she reached out, pulling me into an embrace. I stiffened at first, but then, slowly, I let myself relax, letting go of the anger and resentment that had held me captive for so long. We stood there, two people bound by love and pain, by years of mistakes and misunderstandings, but finally, perhaps, on the path to something different. As I left the hospital that night, I felt lighter than I had in years. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know if my family and I would ever fully reconcile. But I knew one thing for certain. I was free. Free from the anger, the bitterness, the endless cycle of sacrifice and betrayal. For the first time, I could truly look forward to a life unburdened by the past, to a future I had built with my own hands. And whatever happened next, I knew I would be okay. In the weeks following my father's hospitalization, life settled into a new rhythm, one that, strangely, included my family again. It wasn't like before, though. I kept boundaries, clear ones, ones that protected the life I'd built and reminded me of all I'd fought to create on my own. But somehow, I found myself slowly letting them back in, cautiously and carefully, as if testing the weight of every step. My father was stable, though he wasn't the same. After the stroke, he was weaker, more vulnerable, his once commanding presence softened by the limits of his recovery. I visited him occasionally, and each time I saw a flicker of gratitude in his eyes, as if he understood the rarity of my presence. In our brief conversations, he'd ask about my life, my work. He seemed genuinely interested, and though it was late, his questions held a sincerity I'd never felt from him before. Meanwhile, my mother seemed to make every effort to reconnect, sending small messages, checking in, even suggesting we meet for lunch. At first, I brushed her off, unwilling to let things go back to how they were. But over time, I found myself agreeing to a lunch here, a coffee there, always careful to keep the conversations light. For the first time, she listened more than she spoke, her defenses lowered, her words laced with a vulnerability I'd never associated with her before. But my brother, Leo, was another story. He was still in trouble, his debts still mounting, and my parents were on edge, worried that his reckless behavior would only dig them deeper into a hole. They kept their pleas subtle, hinting around the edges, suggesting that he just needed one more chance, that he was going through a rough patch. But I kept my boundaries firm. I would help my parents emotionally, support them through their own recovery, but Leo was on his own. One evening, after a long day at work, I came home to a voicemail from my mother. She sounded anxious, her voice trembling as she spoke. Eva, I know you've done so much, and I don't want to put you in this position, but Leo's in real trouble. He's about to lose everything. We've tried to help, but there's only so much we can do. He's family, Eva. If there's any way you can see it in your heart to help him, please just think about it. I hung up, a bitter taste in my mouth. Family, that word again, so easily used, as if it held some magical power to erase all the hurt, to mend all the years of sacrifice and resentment. But I knew better. Leo had made his choices, and I had made mine. I wasn't about to throw away everything I'd worked for just because he was facing the consequences of his own actions. But the next morning, my mother called again, this time with an edge of desperation that made me pause. He's really struggling, Eva. We don't know what else to do. I know it's not fair to ask you, but he's still your brother. My frustration boiled over. Mom, I've done everything I could for this family. I've sacrificed more than you'll ever understand. Leo has had every chance in the world, and he's blown it every time. You can't keep asking me to clean up his mess. She was silent for a moment, and then she said, softly, I know, Eva. I know you've done more than anyone should ever have to do. But if you don't help him, I'm afraid he might be lost to us forever. I took a long, deep breath, feeling the weight of her words settling over me like a heavy blanket. I didn't want to help him. I didn't want to be dragged back into that life of endless sacrifice and responsibility. But the thought of truly losing him, of watching him spiral into a place he couldn't come back from, it haunted me. After a sleepless night, I finally agreed to meet with Leo, more out of obligation than any genuine desire to help. When he walked into the cafe, he looked worse than I'd ever seen him, disheveled, his eyes dull, a shadow of the confident, carefree boy I remembered. He sat across from me, avoiding eye contact, fidgeting with his hands. Thanks for meeting me, he mumbled, his voice barely audible. I crossed my arms, keeping my tone firm. I'm not here to bail you out, Leo. I need you to understand that. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the table. I know. I didn't expect you to. I just wanted to talk. I raised an eyebrow, skeptical. About what? He took a shaky breath, and for the first time, he looked up, his eyes filled with a vulnerability I'd never seen before. I messed up, Eva. I know I've made a lot of mistakes, and I know I don't deserve anything from you. But I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to be better. Something in his tone softened me, just a little. I wasn't about to forgive him for everything, but there was a flicker of honesty in his words, a hint of the brother I'd once loved and protected. Leo, I said, choosing my words carefully, You need to understand that life isn't going to hand you anything. I've had to fight for everything I have, and no one handed me a second chance when I was struggling. You have to take responsibility for your choices. You have to be willing to do the hard work. He nodded, his expression a mix of shame and regret. I know. I'm trying, but it feels like every time I try to get up, I fall right back down. I sighed, feeling a reluctant pang of sympathy. Then maybe it's time to stop looking for shortcuts. Maybe it's time to really work on yourself, to figure out who you want to be and what you're willing to sacrifice to get there. He looked at me, his face softening with something that resembled gratitude. Thank you, Eva. I know I don't deserve your help, but thank you for giving me this chance. I nodded, feeling the last remnants of resentment start to fade. This is your last chance, Leo. I'm not going to keep pulling you out of trouble. If you want to change, it has to start with you. Over the next few months, I watched as Leo tried to turn his life around. He stumbled more than once, faced setbacks that made him question everything, but he kept going, kept fighting to become something more than the spoiled boy I'd once known. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I doubted he'd make it. But each time he fell, he picked himself back up, determined to prove that he could be better. My parents, too, seemed to have changed in small but meaningful ways. They stopped asking for constant sacrifices, started respecting the boundaries I'd set. My mother and I would meet for lunch now and then, and instead of endless requests or guilt-laden conversations, we talked about life, about work, about the things that mattered to us outside of the family drama. It wasn't perfect, and I doubted it ever would be, but it was a start. One day, as I sat in my office, reviewing a report from a recent project, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Leo. Just wanted to say thanks. I know I haven't said it enough, but I wouldn't have made it this far without you. I stared at the message, a warmth spreading through my chest. I didn't respond right away, didn't know how to put into words the complicated mix of emotions that his message stirred in me. But I felt a sense of peace, a quiet satisfaction in knowing that, despite everything, I'd helped him find his way. In the end, the life I'd built was still mine. I'd fought for it, sacrificed for it, and now I could finally share it on my own terms. I wasn't bound by obligation or guilt. I wasn't the family's safety net anymore. I was Eva, a woman who had survived, who had thrived, who had finally learned to forgive and to live without the weight of the past. And as I sat there, looking out at the city skyline, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a genuine, unburdened happiness, a sense that I was exactly where I was meant to be. For the first time, my life was truly my own, and whatever came next, I knew I was ready. In the months that followed, I felt a quiet kind of contentment, the kind that settles in after a long battle has been fought and won. My relationship with my family wasn't perfect. It wasn't healed in some miraculous way that erased years of hurt. But it was more honest, grounded in the boundaries I had fought so hard to establish. I felt like I had finally found a balance, a way to care for them without losing myself in the process. Leo, remarkably, was making real progress. After years of watching him stumble, it was strange to see him genuinely committed to building something stable. He found a job that suited him, nothing glamorous, but solid work that let him contribute, that kept him grounded. I could see the change in him, the quiet confidence that had always been missing, as though he'd finally started to grow into himself. We didn't talk as often as we used to, but when we did, there was an unspoken understanding, a shared acknowledgement of everything that had passed between us. I could see that he was grateful, even if he couldn't always find the words. One afternoon, I was visiting my parents, something that had become a rare but comfortable routine. They had downsized to a smaller house after my father's health scare, a modest place on the edge of town that felt less like a shrine to the past and more like a fresh start. The atmosphere was different now, quieter, less tense. My father was sitting in the living room, flipping through a newspaper, and my mother was fussing over some tea she'd insisted on making. It was calm, ordinary in a way I'd once thought was impossible. As we sat there, chatting about nothing in particular, my mother suddenly turned to me, her face softened by an expression I couldn't quite place. "Eva," she began, her voice hesitant, I don't think we've ever told you this, but we're proud of you. Truly. For everything you've done. For everything you've become. We should have told you that years ago. Her words caught me off guard, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. I'd spent so long waiting for their approval, for some acknowledgement that my sacrifices had mattered, that hearing it now, after all this time, was almost surreal. Thank you, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. That means a lot. My father looked up, nodding slowly. We were wrong, Eva, about so many things. We took you for granted, and that's something we'll have to live with. But we're grateful you found a way to forgive us. I nodded, letting the moment settle over us, feeling the warmth of their words seep into the parts of me that had remained guarded, even after all this time. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't a clean slate, but it was real, and that was enough. As the evening drew on, my mother brought out a box of old family photos, smiling as she flipped through them. I thought maybe we could go through these together, she said, her tone light, but I could sense the weight behind her words. This was her way of reconnecting, of trying to bridge the gaps between us, even if it was just through faded memories. We spent the next hour sifting through the past, laughing at childhood photos, telling stories I hadn't heard in years. There was a warmth in the room, a sense of nostalgia that made the years of distance feel smaller, more manageable. For the first time, I felt like we were a family in the truest sense, not bound by obligation or guilt, but by shared memories, by a quiet love that had somehow survived everything we'd been through. As I left that night, my heart felt full in a way I hadn't expected. I realized that I didn't need their validation, didn't need them to change in any profound way. All I needed was the peace of knowing that I had done everything I could, that I had fought for my happiness and found it on my own terms. The rest was just a bonus. In the following weeks, my life continued on its steady path. My career was thriving, my friendships deepening, and for the first time, I allowed myself to think about what might come next. I'd spent so many years focused on survival, on proving myself, that I'd never really considered the possibility of a future beyond that. But now, with the weight of the past finally lifted, I found myself wondering what else was out there. One evening, after a particularly long day at work, I got a call from Leo. He sounded nervous, which was unusual for him, and I braced myself for whatever news he was about to share. Eva, he began, his voice cautious, I know this might sound strange, but would you come to dinner with me and the family next week? I want to celebrate something. Curious, I agreed, and a week later, I found myself sitting at a table with my parents and Leo, the four of us together in a way that hadn't happened in years. Leo was beaming, his excitement almost palpable, and I couldn't help but smile as he fidgeted, clearly eager to share his news. I got a promotion, he announced, his eyes shining. It's not much, but it's a big step for me. I wanted to celebrate with all of you because, well, because you're my family, and I wouldn't have made it here without you. His words hit me in a way I hadn't anticipated, and as I looked around the table, I felt a swell of pride, not just in Leo, but in all of us. We'd come so far, had faced so many challenges, but somehow, we'd found our way back to each other. The evening passed in a blur of laughter and stories, and as I sat there, surrounded by the people who had once been the source of so much pain, I felt something shift inside me. It was a quiet acceptance, a sense of belonging that I hadn't felt in a long time. When the night finally ended, and we were saying our goodbyes, my mother pulled me into a tight hug, her voice soft as she whispered, Thank you for giving us a second chance, Eva. We don't deserve it, but we're grateful. I hugged her back, feeling the last of my resentment melt away, replaced by a sense of peace that was both unfamiliar and deeply comforting. I had given them a second chance, and in doing so, I'd found a kind of closure I hadn't known I needed. As I walked home that night, I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the years of struggle, of sacrifice, of learning to set boundaries and find my own way. It hadn't been easy, and there were scars that would always remind me of the battles I'd fought. But now, standing on the other side, I realized that those scars were a part of me, a testament to my resilience, to the strength I'd discovered in myself. In the days that followed, I returned to my life with a renewed sense of purpose. I threw myself into my work, embraced my friendships, and allowed myself to dream of a future that wasn't defined by the struggles of the past. I even started exploring the possibility of a relationship, something I'd avoided for years out of fear of being hurt, of repeating the same patterns. But now, with a heart that felt whole and unburdened, I found myself open to the idea of sharing my life with someone. Looking back, I could see how far I'd come, how much I'd grown. I had built a life on my own terms, had fought for my happiness, and found it in ways I hadn't expected. And now, with my family slowly becoming a part of that life, I felt like I'd come full circle, like I'd finally found a way to reconcile the past with the present. I was Eva, a woman who had learned to set boundaries, to forgive, to let go of the pain, and embrace the future with open arms. My story wasn't perfect, and there would always be moments of doubt, of lingering wounds that reminded me of where I'd come from. But now I knew I was strong enough to face whatever came next, to continue building a life filled with love, with purpose, with the quiet contentment I'd spent so long searching for. And as I looked toward the future, I knew that, for the first time in my life, I was exactly where I was meant to be.